Good morning, Momentum. Welcome to those here in person, and a special welcome to those watching online at mochurch.tv. My name is Jeremy Speth, a.k.a. Jeremy Buckets. I'm one of the elders here at Momentum, and if you're wondering where Dan is or where he's been, so usually during the month of July, we give him a little bit of a break. So he gets a break from preaching, and he spends a lot of time working on some behind-the-scenes stuff and big-picture stuff, just to get us through the rest of the year. So we're just glad that, we can give him that break. So that means you're stuck with me today. So today we're talking about adventurous people. And growing up, I always kind of considered myself an adventurous person. And my buddies and I, we grew up a couple of blocks from Garfield Park, so we'd always spend a lot of time exploring the park, whether on foot or whether riding bikes. He also had some woods behind, my one buddy had some woods behind his house that led to this old abandoned hospital that we'd often go and explore as 12 and 13-year-olds. I know, pretty scary, right? But most of all, I always loved being outside. I always loved nature, and camping has always been one of my favorite things. John Eldridge, who wrote the book Wild at Heart, John's one of my favorite authors, and in his book, he has a quote: "Adventure, with all of its requisite danger and wildness, is a deeply spiritual longing written into the soul of the man." And man, I think that's so true. I think, all of us have this sense of adventure. Whether, adventure for everybody looks a little bit different. So for some people, it could be riding roller coasters. For others, it could be exploring someplace out in nature. For some, you could be a parent with a bunch of kids, and an adventure could be going to the grocery store on a Saturday. Looks completely different for everybody. But I really love this because I really think that this is something that God has put into our souls. And if you look through the Old Testament, it's filled with some crazy stories of adventure. One of the first ones that comes to mind is the Israelites. The Israelites traveled through the desert for 40 years. Now some people will take 6 months off and go hike the Appalachian Trail, but they traveled through the desert for 40 years. In that time, you had Moses. Moses decided he's going to climb Mount Sinai so he can go meet God. And Mount Sinai is 7,497 feet. I'm guessing there probably wasn't some established trails. He didn't have the best hiking boots, didn't have trekking poles. So I'm guessing that there was definitely an adventure in that hike to the top of that mountain. And, then I think about Noah. Noah builds this ark, puts all these animals on the boat, the earth floods. For all we know, Noah could have been the first person to sail around the world. We don't know. So there's all these different adventures in there. And if you saw that little video promo before the sermon started, monthly I host an event here called Rigs and Coffee. And Rigs and Coffee is just an event for just like-minded people to get together and kind of show off their rigs and have coffee. And a couple of months ago, I was kind of reflecting on how did I get here? How did this come to be? And it kind of crazy how everything happens. So back in 2015, I had a good friend whose daughter has cystic fibrosis. And after volunteering at different events with him, I just kind of wanted to do more, and I wanted to be able to give, try to get more money to that community. So I was poking around on their website, and they had this event called the Extreme Hike. And the Extreme Hike is a one-day, 20 or 30-mile hike, and it's usually kind of like this big weekend-long event. So you would pretty much spend all summer training, 5-mile hike, 10-mile, 15, 20, all these different, hikes to try to get up to that 20-ish mile mark. And this one was kind of unique, and it had some fundraising goals that you had to meet because it was a big weekend-long event. And one of the scary things about it was, if you didn't reach this goal, you had to pay the difference. Now, at this time when when I was starting this, I had just lost a job and just started a new one and had to take a significant pay cut. So there was some big trust in God. My wife and I, Crystal, we talked about it, and hey, are you sure you can do this? And I'm like, well, we're going to find out. God's got it. So one of my favorite, I did it for 3 years, and my favorite hike was probably the second one that I did, and it was for the Pittsburgh chapter. And it took place in Snowshoe Mountain Resort in West Virginia. And I don't know if anybody's been there, but it is just absolutely gorgeous there. And here's one of the pictures. I could have sat in this spot just for hours and just watching the clouds just kind of roll in and out of the mountains. And the hike itself that morning started at like 4 o'clock in the morning. We had to start. So it was dark. We had headlamps on. And we had some guides taking us through because they were worried about us stumbling across some bears because there were some bears around there. So as we would hike, so here's a bear print, and there's my size 10.5 shoe just so you can see how big that bear was, followed by fresh bear scat. And if you're wondering what bear scat is, it's exactly what you think it is. So, there was definitely a sense of adventure. And there's another one of the group that I was with, us coming across the finish line. I'm hiking over here. And I think this hike ignited something in me, this spark for adventure. Because just to get up to the resort, it's just an absolute amazing drive. It was fall when we were there, so some of the leaves had started changing already. And you drive up this mountain, and the day we got there, we thought we were driving through the fog. No, we were driving through clouds. And, it was just amazing. And once those clouds lifted the next morning, just to see some of the views like this out there. So in late 2018, there were 4 of us, and we decided we're going to come up with our own hike. So we were going to go out to Pikes Peak in Colorado, and we were going to hike Pikes Peak. And if you're not familiar with it, there's a trail called the Bar Trail. It's a 13-mile hike with an almost 7,400-foot elevation gain. So it's not for the faint of heart. So we kind of started our training for this. But by the end of 2019, everybody else would kind of back out, and it was just me. And I'm like, you know what? I actually really enjoy kind of hiking by myself. So I got this idea of, hey, I'm going to travel out there by myself. So I start going online, I start researching and looking up, like, how can I live out of my car? Like, how does homeless people live in their cars? So I start Googling all these weird different things, and I kept coming back to this one word, and it was called overlanding. And I'm like, what is overlanding? I have no idea what this is. And once I Googled it, I didn't realize that I was about to step into a rabbit hole that there is no ladder tall enough to get you out of. So, according to Wikipedia, overlanding, or 4x4 touring, is self-reliant overland travel to remote destinations where the journey is the principal goal. Typically, but not exclusively, it's accomplished with mechanized, off-road capable transport from bikes to trucks, where the principal form of lodging is camping, often lasting for extended lengths of time, sometimes months and years, and spanning international boundaries. So people will basically build their rigs, because the simplified term would be vehicle-based adventure travel. So what does a rig look like, you may ask? We've got some examples. So this was at one of our Rigs and Coffee events back in February, where I was adventuring in Alaska with Dan at this point. So somebody else sent this to me. So this guy's got like a basic Jeep Gladiator that he put this alu-cab cab into. This part folds down so he can climb in there. He's got a heater. He's got a little fireplace in here that you can't really see. So he's well equipped to go off the beaten path. And then here's kind of like a more simplified version of one where he's got a little more dumbed down, a little bit lighter weight so he can carry more stuff. This is one of my favorites. This is Bob and Lisa. They're a retired couple. And this started off as a Ford F-350 Tremor where they took the bed off and they put this Hawk flatbed, or they put this flatbed and then this camper on top of it. And here's kind of some inside pics of the camper. So they've got 2 dogs that they travel with. Now, right after they built this rig, they took off and drove up to Alaska for 2 months. And like I said, the journey is part of the adventure. So you can see their rig right here, and this is just outside of Hyder, Alaska, or there's a little town in Stewart in British Columbia. And they are camping on a 4-service road, so obviously you got to have a vehicle that can get you there. And this is Salmon Glacier back here in the background. And, they paid nothing to camp there, but they paid a lot for their rig. So, this is the type of travel that people are doing, and these are the destinations that people are trying to get. And, as I started learning about overlanding and all the different stuff, a lot of the research I did was on YouTube. So I watched a bunch of different content creators and overlanders that are YouTubers, and they'd document their travels or their, how they're building out their rig. But one of the big things that I noticed is there was nobody here on the East Coast. There's like nobody here east of the Mississippi. And that's because we lack one thing out here, public lands. Out west, they have all these public lands out there that are owned by the government that have hundreds and hundreds of miles of roads that you can go out and explore for free. So because of that, there's just nothing over here on this side. And one of the things that I was always kind of bummed about was like, man, the community that they have out there. Like, they have these expos, they have these rallies. You see people, like 5 or 6 different overlanders get together and travel and share their journeys. And I'm like, man, that sucks. Like, I wish there was a community around here for that. And that would kind of change in April of 2021. And I remember scrolling through Facebook, and all of a sudden pops up a Rigs and Coffee event this weekend, and it's 10 minutes from my house. I was ecstatic. I told my wife, I'm like, hey, I got to go to this. Like, it's Saturday. Like, this is going to be awesome. And when I pulled up, it was amazing to see all of these like-minded people that were all just into travel and just wanting to get out and explore the world. And as I started walking around, I was just thinking to myself, man, I've kind of found my people. Now, little did I know how much showing up at this first event was going to completely change my life over the next few years. And we met at a restaurant right outside Pinecrest, and the restaurant was very friendly at the beginning, but kind of got a little inhospitable towards the end. So it was, we could go use their bathrooms inside, then it was, no, you can't come inside. Then it was, you can park over here. Oh, no, you can only park way over back there in the corner. So I told Jim, who was the guy that organized, so he started a group called Great Lakes Adventure Ohio to be able to host this event. So I talked to Jim, and I said, hey, I know the church I go to, we're out in Macedonia, we're right off the freeway, we've got a pavilion, a big fire pit, big parking lot. I know one of the elders there. I can talk to them and see if, maybe they'd be willing to host it if you're willing to move it there. I know it's kind of weird meeting at a church and all. And he's like, yeah, let me know what they say. So, what's cool about that is one of the things that we often talk about in our elders meetings is what are different ways that we can use this building and this land to kind of glorify you, God? Like, what are different ways that we can open this up to the community? So it was really, really cool to be able to go back and tell Jim, like, hey, you know what, I talked to everybody, and if you're cool with it, like, we can move it here. So starting in here's a couple of pics, actually, from the first couple Rigs and Coffees that you can see. So this guy's got this Tacoma with this crazy pull-out kitchen that pulled all the way out of the bed of his truck. And then here's just the next one of all the different rigs and different people that had kind of showed up at that first event. So in January of 2022, here at Momentum, we would host our first Rigs and Coffee event. And it was a bitter cold morning. When we got here, the temperature was -4, and that was before the wind chill. So, and it was a windy morning, so it was cold. And there was probably 5 or 6 of us that had showed up at this. And I think we got a picture of that one too. So you can see we're all huddled around a little fire pit there. Eventually, we would all circle our rigs up to block the wind because it was so cold. But what's cool is, this event doesn't just bring people from our local community, it brings people from more of a regional community. So we've got a regular that comes up from Pittsburgh, regulars that come from Columbus, Dayton. We had one guy come down north of Detroit, drove 4 hours to get here for this event, just to come hang out because these are his people, and it's just this sense of community that we have here. And what's cool is there are people from so many different walks of life, so many different people. There are people that I know are followers of Jesus, and we've talked about, what it looks like to follow Jesus in that community sometimes. And there are people that I know that are super far from God from their social media posts or from conversations. There's one guy that's a regular. I couldn't tell you his name to save my life. I know exactly what kind of car he drives or truck he drives, and I know what his Instagram name is, but I couldn't tell you what his name is. But he has a gigantic sticker in the back of his rig when you open it up that says atheist. So I'm guessing he's probably not a follower of Jesus. But what's cool is he's still here. He's still coming here to this building every single month. And I think Jesus kind of set this example for us, to starting his ministry and all through his ministry as well. And there was a guy named Levi, and if you're following along with the Momentum Same Page Challenge, which through the month of July, just to stay connected as a church, we go through a Bible plan together on the YouVersion app, and we actually just started a new one on Friday. If you want to jump in, let me know, I can help you. But we read this on day 2. So, Mark chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus replied, on hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have come not to call the righteous, but the sinners." And I just love this story because Jesus could have picked anybody. Like, he is God in the flesh. He could have picked anybody to be one of his 12, like one of his 12 main disciples. And he picks Levi, who's a tax collector. Levi would actually later become Matthew, better known as Matthew. But, as a tax collector back then, he collected sales tax, customs, road tolls, and the Jews absolutely hated the tax collectors because most of the time they ripped everybody off. They were thieves, and they also worked for the Romans, which meant they hated them even more. And, if Jesus can choose Levi to be one of his disciples, he can choose me. He can choose you. I mean, he can choose any of us to be his disciples. And I love the last verse, verse 17. On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." And it's just that idea of, he came for me. I'm a sinner. I'm not perfect. I'm sure nobody else in this room is perfect. And he came here and he died for us. He died for our sins. And, one of the cool things that he did is he often had meals with people, and they were usually sinners, tax collectors, thieves, prostitutes, people that were looked down upon in society. These are the people that Jesus went and ate with. And I think that's kind of a lesson for us that if we want to share the word of Jesus and the gospel, we have to take a step out of our comfort zone. Sometimes we're going to have to eat with people that may be different from us, that come from different backgrounds. These were the people that Jesus came to come and save. So some cool stories from Riggs and Coffee. So one of the most often things that I hear, especially since the lobby remodel, is, people come in here and they go, "Wow, it looks really cool in here." And they're amazed that, a church would open up a parking lot, open up their building, let people just show up here on a Saturday, and Momentum provides the coffee. They don't tell Dan, but they don't provide the donuts. I do. So, they show up and we've got coffee and we've got donuts for them. And in the wintertime, a warm place for them to come in with their kids. We've got a playground that their kids can, it's a family-friendly event, so you can bring your kids. There's kids playing on the playground. There's kids out there playing basketball. And, I always hear like, man, that's really cool. I've never seen a church that does that. What's really awesome is back in April, Chick-fil-A in Macedonia contacted Dan, and they said, since the pandemic, they really, really wanted to get involved in giving back to the community again. And he's like, "Hey, I saw a sign out front that said you host this Riggs and Coffee thing. Like, what is this?" And, Dan kind of told me, he goes, "I'd love to provide some chicken biscuits for them." So now we've got Chick-fil-A as kind of like a sponsor or whatever. So every month we have chicken and biscuits. And what's cool is a lot of Jesus' ministry was focused around having meals and breaking bread with people. Like, as long as you consider donuts and Chick-fil-A biscuits breaking bread, then I guess we're kind of like, we're having a meal together. So there was Jim, who started Great Lakes Adventure, last year kind of had some life changes. And last spring, he ended up telling me, he's like, hey, I am selling everything, packing up everything I can into my truck, and I am moving to Montana. And he's like, so, you've done a great job of like just being the kind of like the host, but I'd like to hand it all off to you. And I was like, oh, cool. So now I went from the guy that just showed up at 7 o'clock to make coffee to now I'm the guy running the event, which means the introvert in me is freaking out because now I got to go talk to people. So one of the things that we do is if you're new here, when you come the first time for Rigs and Coffee, I've got stickers that I give out to people. And I'll usually go out and hand out a sticker, and I'll ask them how they heard about it. They hear about it from social media or their friends or whatever. But this forces me out of my comfort zone to go and talk to people. I have to go talk to people. I'm the host. I'm the guy. So there was a group that I had, or an organization that I joined early on in this overlanding thing called Overland Bound. And they recently came out with this app. And I started posting on there. You could post in a rally point or an event. So I started posting the event on there probably 6 or 8 months ago. And this last month, it was kind of cool. The regional director reached out to me, or one of the executive directors reached out to me and said, hey, I saw your post. I know you can only invite just a small group of people in this little like map circle. So you can only invite up to 50 people. He goes, I saw your event. I bumped it up to 900 people for you. My first thought was, I better go get more coffee. So, what was cool about it is because he opened up this radius and so many other people heard about it, I had these 2 amazing stories that just came out of last month's, alone. And there's this guy that showed up. Again, I couldn't tell you what his name was, but he drives a 4Runner, a white one. He showed up really happy when he got out of his truck, his SUV. And he had this big box of donuts, and it was good donuts from like some good bakery, not the boring donuts. And he's like, man, these are my people. He's like, I have been searching to find my people. He's like, my wife and I, we had been doing this for a couple of years, but we couldn't find a community around us. He goes, man, this is awesome. And then in my mind, I'm going, I'm going to use this story in a sermon. You just don't know it yet. So, he would wander around and he'd take a look at all the other rigs and meet some other people. And he'd come back to me a little bit later. And he's like, hey, I know you kind of run this event, but do you go to this church at all? And I said, yeah, I'm here from time to time. I go here. And he's like, hey, when I came in, I saw a sign that said, you got a recovery group that meets here this morning. And I'm like, yeah, we do. And I said, it's run by our own Danger, Russ Goodwin. And Russ does an amazing job. It's for people battling addictions, for battling codependency issues, grief, just, everything. And he does a great job leading this group. I said they meet in the basement and it starts actually pretty soon. He's like, I'm a recovering alcoholic. I've been sober for a year and a half. And I had to miss my AA meeting to be here this morning. Can I go downstairs and just drop in on the meeting? Absolutely. So he went and he got his stuff, took him, showed him where to go downstairs at. So how cool is it that this guy shows up and he's got his people out here in the parking lot, but then he's got his people in the basement. Wasn't even expecting that. He went from hanging out in the parking lot to jumping right into a Mo group. I mean, that very rarely ever happens, but it's so cool that we're able to use this building and this property for that. There was another guy that was here, and this guy was tall. Like, I had to look up to him to have a conversation with him. And he'd come walking out of the lobby and kind of said the same thing. He's like, man, this is amazing in here. And he's like, the garage door and the fireplace, and, like, man, this is so cool. Like, I've never been to a church that would do anything like this. And he's like, I grew up Catholic. My wife grew up in the church. Her dad was a preacher, so she's a Christian. So we often butt heads on different things. He goes, but man, I got to be honest with you. I haven't been to church in years. Like, I don't want anything to do with the church. And he proceeds to kind of tell me his story. And his father had died recently, so him and his brothers wanted to take their mom to Christmas Eve service. So they went, picked her up, and took her to a Catholic church where they grew up in. And he said, we got there, it was kind of cool, nostalgia being there. And the priest starts giving his homily or his sermon and starts off with, where are you guys the rest of the year? How come you're only here on Christmas and Easter? How come I can only see this place full twice a year? Like, imagine what we could do if you were here every week and giving money every single week. And the guy was like, man, he goes, ever since that, he goes, I want nothing to do with the church and Jesus. Like, that just totally turned me off from everything. And I said, what's crazy about that story is, I said, I have the opposite story for you as far as this church. I said, Christmas Eve service is the reason why I'm here today. We had every year at Christmas Eve, I said, and it started years ago, but, we take up a special offering in the beginning, and we call and we order takeout. And when that takeout guy shows up here with that food, we bring him up on stage, and we give him a $500 tip. I said, we do it twice on Christmas Eve for both of the services that we have. And he's like, man, that's so awesome. He goes, I wish I could find a church like this close. He goes, I think my wife and I could really love it, but he's an hour and a half away. He's like, I think this is something my wife and I could really, come to this church together, and I think we'd both be happy here at something like that. There's so many other different stories just over the past couple of years. There's a guy locally that lives here in the Macedonia area, and we had a tree fall down in the front, and he called me up one day and said, and he's become one of my good friends through Riggs and Coffee. He called me up and said, hey, I saw that tree out there. You need help cutting it down? I got a chainsaw. I can, show up here. So him and a couple other guys here from Momentum, we went out there and we cut the tree up and hauled it in the back. And I look back at the park, or the trunk or treat from last year. That was the same day that we hosted Riggs and Coffee, and we had a handful of people from that stay for the trunk or treat, and they all said the same thing. Man, this was such a cool event. Like, the people from your church, like, they're so cool. They're like, not what we expected. Like, this was awesome. Like, I can't wait till next year. Like, I've got all these big things that I'm going to do and how I'm going to decorate my truck last year. This year, the parking lot party. I put a little blurb out there on our Facebook and Instagram page, and we had 5 or 6 families from Riggs and Coffee show up, and they all pulled back, and we all were sitting kind of circled up back around the fire pit back there watching the fireworks. And what's even cooler is one of those families that was there for the parking lot party actually volunteered to pull the trailer for the Twins Day parade. Like, how cool is that? So now we've got, it's awesome. So now we've got these people that have just been coming to hang out to talk about adventures, hanging out with their people, talking about adventures that are now starting to kind of get involved. So, I couldn't make it through a whole sermon, and if you know me, you know what I'm about to say next. So I heard it on a podcast. So you just knew I couldn't get through. It's like Dan with the 5 tattoos. So I was going to try to get one just for today, but so I was listening to the Men in the Arena podcast, and the host Jim was interviewing Willie Robertson from Duck Dynasty. And I don't know if you're familiar with Duck Dynasty at all. It was a wildly popular show based on the Robertson family and their business, the Duck Commander. And it was really kind of one of the only family-friendly shows that you could watch. But he's got a new book out, and it's called The Gospeller. And you're probably like, okay, what's a Gospeller? I feel like the Dictionary Britannica today, like all these definitions of all these weird words. So a Gospeller is a person who zealously teaches or professes faith in the gospel. So it's typically someone who is not in ministry or someone who's not paid to do this. So guess what? I'm a Gospeller. You're a Gospeller. You're a Gospeller. You're a Gospeller. We're all Gospellers. Like, it's all of our job to be able to share the gospel with others. And Willie kind of goes in his book, in his first chapter of the book, it talks about just how his parents, Phil and Kay, how they became Christians, like how they became followers of Jesus. And he writes in there, my dad's life BC, before Christ, was a whole different story. Phil was a rank heathen, in his own words, and Kay, his wife, said he was the devil. Sounds like a great guy. Sounds like he'd be at Riggs and Coffee. So, Phil would end up leaving his family, and he would end up leaving them behind in They were in West Monroe, Louisiana. He would leave him behind, and he was actually running from the law through some different bar fights, and he was kind of in trouble, so he was just living in the swamp and living off the land. And he'd end up running a honky-tonk in Arkansas. I know it's the first time it's ever been said on the stage. So that's just another name for a bar. So he ends up running this bar down there, and he is just totally lost, just completely out there. And there was this new church in his hometown that was getting ready to launch. And there was this young pastor named Bill Smith who had this passion for the lost and for broken people. And it was him, a group of families, and a wealthy businessman starting this church. And the businessman said, he's like, you know what? I know I can't preach. I know I can't do any of this, but I got money, so I can help. And what's cool about that businessman is that businessman, Willie's wife, Corey, that was her grandfather. That was the businessman and the money man behind this story and starting this church. So Phil had a younger sister named Jan. And one day she went to Bill, Brother Bill they called him, and she's like, hey, I really need you to go share the gospel with my brother Phil. My brother Phil is lost, he is broken, like I really need you to go share the story of Jesus with him. So I was like, okay, cool, is he out here? He's like, nope. Oh, does he like live in town? And she's like, nope. And he's like, well, where is he? Well, you have to go to him, and he's running a bar in Arkansas. So Brother Bill one day gets in his car, drives a couple hours out to Arkansas, finds Phil at this bar, and sitting at a bar stool right next to him, shares the story of Jesus with him. Now, Phil wouldn't, there was no miraculous like conversion right there. He didn't go baptize him in a vat of beer someplace or in a river. Like, Brother Bill left, and Phil was like, hey, thank you. I thanks for sharing that with me. I'll think about it. So Brother Bill just leaves. And there's a cool verse in 1 Corinthians 3, 6 through 7. And there it is. So it says, I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. So think about that verse. Like, how cool is it that Brother Bill went out there and planted the seed? Like, he was probably the person that planted this seed. And who knows what other events helped water it. But we still have to rely on God to make that grow and to make that come to fruition. And a year later, something would, Phil would kind of hit rock bottom. And he would come back just because something Bill said, like this hope of Jesus Christ and how it can change your life. So he would come back to West Monroe, and he knew his marriage was just gone. Like his wife didn't want anything to do with him. His kids didn't know who he was. But he ended up becoming a Christian and following Jesus. And what Willie talks about in his book is just the ripple effect of Bill planting that seed with Phil. Like, here was a show that they said the only way that we'll do this show is if at the end of each episode we can pray. They kind of share like a story and a prayer with all of them sitting around the dinner table. When was the last time you saw the bachelor or bachelorette pray at the end? Probably never. But how cool is this, just from him doing this, started this show that has gone out to millions, that this may be the first way that they ever see the gospel, or hear about it, is just from from watching this crazy show. So my question to you this morning is, who are your people? Like, who are the people that you're supposed to reach? Mine are Adventurous people from Riggs and Coffee. Maybe for you it's coworkers. Maybe it's other teachers you teach with. Maybe it's other parents from your kids' sports teams. Maybe it's your family, But who are those people, that you're supposed to reach? In the book, and they talked a lot about this during the podcast, and I absolutely love this quote. You never know what you'll get when you ask people about their lives. Like, you never know. Just a simple question. I had a guy share his whole faith journey with me just by a simple conversation and a simple question. And they also talked a lot about John chapter 4, the woman at the well. Jesus was leaving Judea to return to Galilee. And there were many other ways that he could go. But in John chapter 4, it said he had to go through Samaria on the way. So he had to go through there. And think about the lives that he changed just from asking one simple question from the woman at the well. Can I have a drink of water? That's it. And that simple question started a huge conversation. So, ironically enough, next week is Rigs and Coffee. It's here Saturday from 9 to 1. So I invite all of you. I invite you guys, come meet my people. You know, maybe you can help plant a seed, or maybe you can be the one that helps waters a seed. You know, I would love for one day, I would absolutely love to be able to baptize one of my friends from Rigs and Coffee, or to see a generosity story that starts with, yeah, I started coming here because of Rigs and Coffee. How cool would that be to see that there could be a family tree that's changed just by hanging out with other adventurous people? Let's pray.